Okay, good afternoon. Thanks very much for coming to the last session, the graveyard shift today. I just mentioned this briefly a few minutes ago, but for anybody who just joined in the last couple of minutes, if you're expecting a level 400 session, that's not this session despite the session code. So if you want a deep dive and there's something else that you wanted to see instead, feel free to bail. Hopefully, one person remains. Can you hear me okay at the back? You guys, yeah? Cool. Just want to double check after the last session. So my name's Spencer Harbour. I'm based in Edinburgh in the United Kingdom, SharePoint architect. It doesn't really matter, but my contact details are there if you want to follow up with questions that we can't get to during the conference over the next couple of days. So the agenda for this session is really to, first of all, provide a level set on information security fundamentals. Whilst this is not directly related to SSL certificates, it's incredibly important in terms of understanding why SSL is becoming increasingly important and indeed has become a prerequisite for many SharePoint deployment scenarios. It also provides us a counterpoint to many of the challenges, both political and technical, we have in organizations when trying to push through the implementation of technology that doesn't really match up with policy and procedure from the not too distant past in the information security world, especially when working for federal and military customers. We'll then do a very brief introduction of SSL itself. How many of you here would regard yourselves as an SSL guru, SSL god? Anybody willing to go for it? No. There's not many of them, I must admit. I'm certainly not, I wouldn't class myself as one. I used to be a security professional, but the ins and outs of how it works behind the scenes are important, of course, when it comes to troubleshooting, but for the purposes of this material, it's just going to be a brief overview. Then we'll talk about really why SSL is now so important, specifically to SharePoint 2013. But also think about some of the reasons why it's important anyway, regardless of the version that we're using. That conversation is really feature-focused, but we'll also touch on some of the other considerations in terms of how the industry in general is moving in terms of transport layer considerations. Then we'll talk a little bit about the points of configuration, how we can make our lives a little bit easier, a demonstration of some basic configuration, and if we have time, which we probably will in this session, we can also look at a few other aspects as we go in an ad hoc fashion. And then some recommendations both for SharePoint 2013 in on-premises deployments, but also for Office 365 Identity Federation at the end. So that's our agenda. Let's dive into a level set on information security. Now, this material is probably going to be seen by many as quite controversial, but it's not really new stuff. In fact, most of it is exceedingly old. We find ourselves in the industry in general, of applying information security principles and procedures and technology from over 25 years ago to the deployment scenarios we work with. And of course, there is a large vested interest in retaining that in the industry. So the fundamental thing we must understand about information security is based on three core components. The first one is confidentiality, ensuring that only the people who have access to information are able to access it. That's obviously a key component of secure sockets or any other form of transport layer encryption. Then we have integrity. Integrity is fairly strict, fairly obvious. It's ensuring that information cannot be intercepted and changed, the idea of repudiation. And then the one that most people in the information security business kind of discount to a large degree is availability. The principle here is that a system cannot be considered secure if it is not available. And that's hugely important because there's obviously overlap between these three sort of aspects, but there's also compromise. And that's especially true when we start thinking about the reasons why traditionally people have been nervous or apprehensive or resistant to working with SSL certificates in large environments. Because in order to be able to provide the levels of availability and disaster recovery necessary, it makes it that much more complicated. Now, this thing that's sort of ironically termed the CIA triad has been around forever. This is core material from the certified information security professionals kind of material. This is what drives any other more granular kind of taxonomy for defining information security and the risks inherent. And nothing has changed here, right? Whichever risk or threat we face will fit into this taxonomy. And it's very easy to explode the taxonomy, make it more complicated than it needs to be. But it doesn't actually give us anything, right? These three things are applicable today when we're talking about configuring a server-to-server trust-based application in SharePoint as they ever were with the effective invention of network-based computing. So we'll keep coming back to things that are fundamentally in one or more of these buckets as we go through the rest of the material. Let's get a little bit more real world, though. Information security is fundamentally about people and processes. Okay? There is no technology solution that can solve these problems for us, that can mitigate risk alone. There are no silver bullets. There's plenty of people trying to sell you silver bullets, right? Firewalls, web application security devices, intrusion detection systems, etc., etc. But without adequate people and processes, none of those tooling solutions are going to help you. Anybody here remember the Azure outage a year or so ago? Yeah? A couple of you, a few of you. If you remember the root cause analysis that Microsoft published, it's all around people and process, right? The ability to deploy the renewed certificates correctly. Similarly, with intrusion the most publicly known intrusion situations is not the intrusion detection system failing, but the secure operations center staff and processes failing. And that's very relevant to SSL because one of the traditional reasons why many sort of shy away from implementing SSL for web applications is dealing with certificate renewal. Okay? Then there's the status quo. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to use my nice little picture of a rockin' band from back in the day. I had to take that out. But anyway, I'm not talking about the terrible rock band. What I'm talking about here is effectively the lock-in to ideas about how to solve some of these problems. In other words, deploying point solutions to solve problems or to take a risk away from a deployment. So that goes true for vendors in the industry, the consultants that work for them, and the practices that are promoted. A good example here is a network load balancer. Okay? It's got not really anything to do with security, just a regular network load balancer, a device that you can buy. One of the best practices for one of the leading load balancers in the marketplace is to restrict the size of the incoming HTTP request. Okay? Because from years and years and years ago, that was like a performance tweak, right? Get the most performance out of the devices. And unfortunately, that comes up in my world probably once every 6 months on projects where that's been done. And that means that end users cannot authenticate to the system because now authentication tokens are so large that they are truncated by that configuration on the device. Also, legacy architectures. If you think about the idea of an internet-facing website where you have the web servers in a demilitarized zone, or DMZ for the Americans, okay? And you have your database running that system behind a firewall. And in that scenario, in most cases, Windows authentication is not allowed from the web server to the database server. That's an example of a legacy architecture. If we're truly on the journey to the cloud, those kind of things have got to go away. Now, I'm not saying it's easy for them to go away, and if those solutions work, what's the rationale for moving away from them? They will remain for a very long time. We've been trying to get rid of these legacy architectures for a while already. But we need to be clear that when we're changing our deployment models, or we want to get prepared for futures, especially with respect to things like hybrid, we need to ensure that we're not restricted by that, by the in-place architectures, practices, and products as well that are in that space. And you can see that across the industry in the way that reverse proxy products are now having to face fundamental revisions in the way they work in order to support deployment scenarios such as hybrid cloud solutions. And then there's compromise, the architect's favorite word, okay? Systems architecture and implementation is always a compromise. There's just far too many moving pieces these days in a distributed system. And so we have to compromise the ability to deliver versus the standards that are in place within the organization, which usually are very kind of outdated. A good example is a question that came up 3 or 4 times earlier today and just before the session regarding the use of a wildcard DNS attribute in a SAN certificate, which commonly is not allowed inside large corporations, federal education, and military deployments. Okay? And that is currently today a hard technical requirement for SharePoint 2013 workflows. Without that wildcard attribute in the certificate, SharePoint 2013 workflows do not function. It's as simple as that. So if the business wants the delivery of that capability, there has to be a compromise with the standard in play. Also, examples here include things like the existing infrastructure. How many of you have experienced the pain where you want to do something with SharePoint, you have to do it sort of slightly differently to the way you want to because of the firewall or the network load balancer that you have in the environment? Yeah, I mean, it's very common. So there's the ideal world SharePoint topology, but you've got to do it slightly differently because of, the implementation of a firewall. Naturally, large corporations like roadmaps. This stuff is expensive. If you've spent millions of dollars on a huge infrastructure for firewall and perimeter management, you expect that it's going to be in play for many years in order for you to get the return on that investment, right? But that's another example of the compromise. Enterprise architecture. If you work with large corporate organizations, especially one that's distributed across regions or indeed across the globe, it's natural that some regions are going to be kind of a little bit further ahead in their thinking. And then development practices. This is IIT Pro track, but we should never forget development practices. It's the age-old, well, it worked on the developer's workstation, and we're the guys that have got to try and figure out, how the hell to get it to work when we deploy it onto a real environment. And this is perhaps best sort of demonstrated, at least in the context of what this talk is about, is the option to allow OAuth over HTTP. Well, that's all very well and good, and it's certainly the right thing that Microsoft allows us to deploy with that setting, for development environments. And in principle, it shouldn't make any difference. If that's set in development, it shouldn't have an impact when you deploy to an environment where SSL is required. But the reality is, there's no way of knowing until you do it. And it's also pertinent because I'm not just talking about the development practices of those of us who are building solutions on top of SharePoint, but it's also applicable to the development of the product itself. Okay? Naturally, it's a large system. Many compromises need to be made. There's only so much money to go around, right? We have to figure out where it's best to invest our time and resources. And that leads to things that block us from doing what we want to be able to do. And that's why these kind of conferences are so valuable, because this is our opportunity to feed back to the vendor, get them to understand just how important these scenarios are to us in the real world. Information security is all about managing risk. There is no such thing as a secure system. Even if we take our servers and put epoxy glue in all the USB ports and unplug it from the network, power it off, there's still risk there, right? The disks on eBay, those kind of things. Everything is about how we choose to manage risk. And we have options there. The first one, the most common, is to ignore it completely. Okay? The vast majority of security incidents, at least the ones that are high profile, the ones that you read about in the IT press and these days in the world news, for the vast majority of them are down to the fact that the risk was ignored. Okay? And there's a subtle difference between ignoring the risk, which could also be described as being ignorant of there being a risk in the first place, and accepting the risk. Most of the high-profile SQL injection vulnerabilities that exposed large corporations to data loss, data theft in the last 5 years is because the organizations knew there was a risk, they accepted it. Right? They weren't willing to spend the money to rebuild the system in a way that would prevent SQL injection via dynamic SQL parameters. Okay? Similarly, those particular examples, all but one of them, were because elements of that infrastructure behind the scenes were going over the transmission, the network traffic was over HTTP, okay, over plain text. So it became even easier to perform the attack. Accepting risk is basically, thinking about it and saying, well, we don't think that's very likely. And, it probably won't cost us that much money or reputational damage if it happens. So we'll just accept it, see how we get on. Getting more and more unacceptable to accept. Then there's the idea of removing risk management. That's quite easy to do. You say to your customer, no, you can't have that. Okay? And then you're fired. Okay? And you've got to find someone else to work for. But this is turning off features, right? The idea of reducing the attack surface, that kind of thing. Then there's the one where the security industry makes all of its money, okay, or most of its money. Mitigating risk, right? If we're vulnerable to SQL injection, we haven't got the source code of the app anymore, so we can't, fix up the application. What we can do is we can put a box, a point solution in front of the application, which allows us to have some form of mitigation against that risk. It doesn't stop it completely, it doesn't remove it, but we can be fairly confident that we're protected there as long as we've got our people and process in place as well. And then obviously to outsource the risk, right? Make it somebody else's problem. Employ a corporation that runs a security operations center to do it for you. Fundamentally, again, we're talking about compromise or trade-offs. Whenever we make a security decision, we're balancing 4 key aspects. The first one is the level of security, right? There's no such thing as a secure network. There is such a thing as an insecure network, but it's shades of gray, right? It's not black or white. It's not secure or not. It's a degree of security. Then there's a degree of complexity, okay? If we have a point solution for web application vulnerabilities, and then we have a point solution for network intrusion, and a point solution for host intrusion, and a point solution for perimeter security, and a bunch of SSL certificates, and a bunch of people who have to keep that running and operational, you've got a very complex system. Okay? Usability, often overlooked. When you're on the internet and you go to a website and you get a certificate warning, what button's the end user going to click? Right? Yeah, I don't care. He's going to click continue. Right? If you prompt a user with yes or no, they're going to click yes. And they're not even going to read anything else. Right? That's the way it plays out. And that is very dangerous because if you think about the the iOS issue with SSL recently, right, where the vast majority of the user base is just carrying on as normal there, right, until the fix was released. And that's not a direct criticism of that vendor. It happens to all of them. I did the Azure example earlier. But usability is very important to consider here. If you think about banking systems, it used to be very easy to log into your bank's website and check your balance and stuff. Nowadays, you've got devices and keypads and text things. Try and think about how somebody who's not that familiar with technology is ever going to be able to log in using those things. There's a lot of barriers to usability. And then supportability. I can make SharePoint really secure. And I've done a lot of experiments with this. The chances of me ever getting product group support for the things I've done to SharePoint in these examples is nil, right? They haven't tested that. They haven't got that running on rigs so they can help me out because I've made it, an unsupportable configuration. So a couple of quotes here. One's a bit better than the other. Da Vinci said, "Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication." That's true in information security, right? The more complex a system, the less secure it will be because the more likely that one tiny setting will pull the rug from all of that time and money and investment that's been made. The reason for bringing this content up with respect to SSL is it sets the scene for what is a really kind of strange situation we have. Don't have too many people in this room. I'm hoping, that these are all the smart people in the room and, the other people are in other sessions, okay? But that demonstrates quite uniquely the situation we face ourselves in. Either everybody here, everybody else who's not in the room say, "Oh, I know all about SSL, that's dead easy," right? Well, we know from, customer experience in the field that that's not going to be the case. Or, "Oh, well, that doesn't matter. We've got a trusted network," et cetera, et cetera. But one of the best things we can do for any SharePoint deployment, whether it's on-premises, small environment on an internal network, to the most complex hybrid SharePoint online integration scenarios, etc. One of the single best things we can do to secure our investment is to implement secure sockets layer. Obviously, with things like hybrid and online, we are forced to because Microsoft understand the importance of this. They're not willing to let us interact with them without using it. In the cloud, or indeed on the internet, everything should flow over what we call the Universal Firewall Bypass Protocol, right? That's the alternative name for Secure Sockets Layer, because this is the way to push through the traditional barriers to doing service interaction. That's where we have to get to. For cloud to be successful, we have a fundamental prerequisite for transport layer encryption. And the only way that we can realistically achieve that, regardless of which vendor we're working with and how things move forward, is secure sockets layer rather than other approaches to transport layer encryption. The assumption that an internal network is secure in almost all cases is entirely false. Indeed, many internal networks are far more vulnerable than the public internet. Okay? Again, this is something that we need to get a step change in our thinking. Originally, obviously, it was the bad guys on the internet, and everybody inside our corporate network was cool. But we're now in a situation where for many corporations, they don't have a corporate internal network, right? There is no edge of the network. Companies are using the public internet as their corporate network. Okay? The only way to be able to do that, really, with any sense of security, any semblance of security, is secure sockets. Again, I mentioned this briefly earlier. Traditionally, when we're just talking kind of about simple web application systems, SSL is generally avoided due to the murky documentation that's out there, confusion about cost of certificates, right? Because the public certificate authorities charge crazy money for certificates. Okay? And then the ones that are cheaper, there's no root certificates on your client device. So, that's apprehension. There's also the renewal process. If we do SSL, that means in 2 years' time, we've got to make sure we get another one. What happens if the guy that was on the CSR contact information has left the company? These kind of considerations. That one in particular is incredibly important because if you walk away from this session and go, yeah, the stuff that Spence was talking about kind of sounds accurate, we should do that, you've got to deal with that renewal process. It's got to be in hand. And it's got to be in hand for a large degree of the kind of configuration that we need to do with SharePoint as well. SharePoint 2013 specifically. Server-to-server trust-based applications, working with Office web applications, working with Workflow Manager. Wherever there's a certificate involved, we have the... Lastly, and certainly by specification actually says this protocol did not consider security in its initial design. If you search for that particular phrase using your internet search engine of choice, you'll see a multitude of specifications. Because when these protocols were invented, that was a long time before the idea of using these systems for the types of things we're dealing with today, many years ago. This is the fundamental problem with internet-based solutions is we are building on top of something that was designed with no intent to be used in the manner it is now. So that's basically what SSL is all about. It allows servers and clients to do exchange between themselves and allows for authentication to happen to guarantee confidentiality and integrity. In terms of the service interaction world, it's going to allow us to establish encrypted connections. So, if we think about Office web applications and SharePoint, SSL is the mechanism that allows that encrypted connection. So it's certificate exchange and trust. It allows us to tell two different systems they trust each other, two different principles. So if you haven't figured out already, the strong recommendation here is that all web applications utilize SSL. There's a number of reasons for this recommendation. If you are deploying SharePoint and not using Windows authentication, you have to protect the transmission of the credentials over the wires. Trusted identity provider. If you went to market and said, yeah, we don't like Windows authentication, we'd like to use, let's call it Acme social network on the internet, right? We want to use our logon for that to log on to our tax portal. And if that vendor or that provider of that solution said, yeah, you can use our identity provider, but it's over HTTP, right? Nobody would do it, would they? Right? It wouldn't be acceptable. So why would it be acceptable inside an allegedly trusted network? It's not, right? It's not SharePoint 2013 and, more importantly than that, future new service investment areas in the product rely on a thing called OAuth 2. Now, OAuth is not an authentication protocol, it's an authorization protocol. But it does, one of the attributes of that approach is that authorization tokens, bearer tokens, are passed over the wire in the clear. So if that isn't an SSL channel, that's a huge risk to accept, an unacceptable risk to accept, especially if you think about the types of data that an app or service interaction built using OAuth 2 is going to be working with, right? If you think about line of business data, even documents, right, list items. We need to make sure that we are mitigating the risk there appropriately. So there's examples all over the place, right? Anytime we configure a server-to-server or what sometimes is referred to as a high-trust application, that's the case. Every time we connect to Workflow Manager, that's the case. Office Web Apps does not use OAuth. It uses a proprietary authorization protocol, but the concepts are basically the same. One thing I'll point out on the subject of OAuth is you may have read the author of that protocol's kind of leaving letter where he basically, slags it off and says, this is terrible. He has some valid concerns, okay? But that's not really anything we can do about it, right? This platform and many others out there in the industry have chosen to use this technology. So, if we want the feature capability, we have to use it. Other non-OAuth scenarios are in a similar boat. Just thinking about having a document library which is storing, let's just call them spaceship designs, right? Just imagine we work for Acme Spaceship Incorporated. We're storing our spaceship design videos, rather large ones, I would hope, in SharePoint, okay? Do we want that going over the wire in plain text? No, because then we do not have confidentiality, integrity. So just protecting sensitive information. How about SQL Server transactional data, hang on, what's it called? Transparent data encryption, okay? Let's say we implement that, but we don't have SQL Server running on SSL. So we're protecting the data at rest, but then we're sending it over the wire in clear. So, yeah, you have to remember there's lots of touch points to these things. We establish trust as well in SharePoint for things, even simple things like the old for service application federation between one farm and another is done by certificate exchange. If we look at newer ways of doing federation in 2013, like we want to have remote search results, we do that again via certificate exchange. So even if we're not going to take the first recommendation and go back and make all our web applications SSL, as practitioners in the SharePoint space, the more comfortable with configuring SSL we are, what the limitations are, what the weak points of the various products in the mix are concerned are, the more valuable we are in the marketplace. Okay, because pretty much any scenario we think about with respect to functional elements of the product, we're going to have to configure this stuff. So we should be using SSL. This is repetitive, at least for the first bullet, but with apps, we need really a wildcard certificate. This and one other aspect, which is nothing to do with security or SSL, is the key kind of gap, if you like, with apps from an infrastructure perspective. Okay? As you should all be aware, we have this app ID in the URL. Okay? The ones that's, obviously nobody's using that URL, or hopefully they're not using that URL to directly browse to apps and things like that. But nevertheless, the HTTP request response has to take place. And so unless every time a user chooses to deploy an app to SharePoint, do you want to request and manage an individual SSL certificate, you need a wildcard certificate. End of story. Okay? So that's an example of the compromise against the policy where many organizations prohibit the use of wildcard certificates. So the question is that just for SharePoint hosted? And the answer, yeah, that's, yeah. You know, so it's a very similar conversation. I was asked a number of times this week about, you know, well, how do we do Kerberos with apps? And it's the same story, right? You need an SPN for every app URL, right? So that's not happening. So that's an example of where the approach to app ID is really the only feasible option, right? The downside, the inevitable compromise, is that we have to accept wildcard SSL certificates or a SAN certificate with a wildcard attribute. Another thing to think about is multiple, this is going to get, I'm going to get sort of words all rolled up and messed up here. Multiple host headers with SSL certificates are now possible with the latest, well, sorry, the latest -1 version of Windows Server, right? IIS 8 and above, allows us to make use of an HTTP extension called server name indication. In the past, if we wanted multiple host headers and SSL, we basically needed a new website because we could only have, you cannot have, or you could not have, I should say, sorry, many combinations of port, IP address, and port and IP address across host headers. So server name indication is one of the key technology enablers for doing large-scale hosting of things like apps in SharePoint and other scenarios that use a similar approach to addressing. This requires a compatible web browser. That's not so much of a problem because all of the recent browsers, and certainly all of the ones that are officially supported with SharePoint and Office 365, are compatible with server name indication. But we have to understand that we're not always using a browser, right? We might be using a mobile phone application. We might be, in which case, it's imperative that the design, the architecture and design and development of that application understands that, is using the right APIs to speak back to SharePoint. But what about, oh, I nearly said it, damn. What about OneNote? Is that going to work? The answer is no, it doesn't work. Because OneNote currently does not understand server name identification. A little bit on wildcards and SAN certificates, and then we'll jump into a demonstration. The only way we can support multiple host names on a single binding in IIS or anybody else's web server is to either use a wildcard certificate or a subject alternative name certificate. Unfortunately, with respect to public certificates, if you want to purchase these, they're a lot more expensive. They're not really any different. But because they're kind of special, you know, we get charged more for them. But there is a clear difference between them. Okay? And the wildcard certificate is basically, you know, covers all host names for a given level of the domain. So a simple example, if we have here woodgrovebank.com, the pub.woodgrovebank.com and hr.woodgrovebank.com are covered. But we can't also do hr.pub.woodgrovebank.com, right? The superdomain is not covered, and neither is the subdomain. So if we do have that requirement, which is, you know, if we think about app URLs, but also our URL namespace design for solutions, it's likely that we're going to want to have that type of deployment where we don't have everything all in one level. Okay? That's where the subject alternative name comes in, where we can include a primary domain and effectively a user-defined list of other domains covered by the same certificate. There's no limitation on the number of host names, it says at the very last point on the slide. That's the technical reality, but you will find, certainly with public certificate authorities, or commercial certificate authorities, is that there are limits. You know, you can get a SAN certificate and up to 5 domains, you know, $200. If you want 10, you know, starts becoming more and more expensive. Nice way to make money, right? Because it's just a dude typing it in, hitting enter. So subject alternative name is, you know, generally speaking, the best approach, because especially if we have control of the certificate authority, it gives us the ability to have pretty much any URL namespace we wish, including the ones that we haven't thought of yet, right, as new scenarios come along. It's just a little bit more unusual and perhaps hidden away in terms of configuration and so forth. Okay, that's enough chat. I'm going to switch over to the demo machine, hopefully. We'll just have a look at some of the basic SSL configuration activities with respect to SharePoint. What I have on this demo machine is a very simple environment of a domain controller, which for the purposes of the demo is running a certificate authority as well. You shouldn't really do that, right? It's okay on test rigs and labs and so on, but for a production environment, definitely, it's not a recommendation to run certificate authority on your domain controller. Right now, the only practical way to have high availability for a certificate authority, and you need high availability for this, right, because if you lose it, you're hosed, is to use clustering. So you don't really want to be clustering your domain controllers. I then have a SQL Server, obviously, one SharePoint machine, and one machine that's running Workflow Manager. This is obviously the SharePoint machine on screen at the moment. The Workflow Manager is, if you were in the previous session, very similar, but it's already had the Workflow Manager farm created, which is great because that means we don't have to wait for that. And I can show you that by browsing to it from the other machine, hopefully. There we go, there's the URL. And I've used deliberately here the self-generated certificates. So when the IIS sort of warms up on the remote machine, I should get back here my certificate warning page. There you go. I'm sure you've all seen this plenty of times. And this is, trivial to deal with, but the number of things that this can break in SharePoint generally is enormous, okay? Because in this case, I'm the end user. This is an interactive experience. I can click green. Interesting psychological experiment in usability. If you swap them round, most people don't continue because the green immediately, leads them to where to click. How do we do that when we're doing Service Application Federation inside SharePoint? Right? Well, we can't. It also impacts things like user profile sync. If the certificate that FIM uses for its services isn't trusted by SharePoint because something's gone wrong on our SharePoint server, profile sync doesn't work. And in this particular case, it's not profile sync's fault. Yeah, it's the certificate trust that's the problem. We couldn't configure this connection to Workflow Manager here if we didn't exchange the certificate in order to establish trust. Now, in this particular case, we're doing this to resolve this problem, okay? But there's many other scenarios where we'll need to do the same thing. If we are configuring Service Application Federation, we're going to have to exchange certificates between two farms. It's exactly the same steps. So I clicked the wrong button, so I'm going to go back to my page that we had. Seem to be having fun over there in the corridor or something. Perhaps they've got the beer line back from yesterday. But we're having fun as well, right? Nothing more fun than SSL certificates. So here we go. I'm going to continue. And I'm going to grab this certificate, and I'm just going to save this out to a file on disk. Oops. Now, I just happen to be on the SharePoint server. And there's a number of ways I can import this into certificate and effectively establish the trust relationship, at least from a service level, between SharePoint and Workflow Manager. And if I was doing this across SharePoint farms, it's the same thing as well. I can do it through central admin. If we dive into the security page and then go into Manage Trust, I will see a trust. Come on, keep up with me. It's only got 12 gig of RAM. In Manage Trust here, I can see the we obviously trust our own farm. But I can go ahead and create a new one in here. I can also do this in PowerShell. And you can see I'm grabbing the file from disk. And these commandlets, which are not SharePoint commandlets, right? They're regular commandlets, get PFX certificate, get certificate, etc. These are the types of commandlets to get very familiar with, as is navigating the certificate store via PowerShell, which gets a little interesting because it's kind of an old school way of leveraging a PowerShell provider. So I'm going to run this. You see it brings me the output. If we come back over here, refresh this page, you see we now have a trust between Workflow Manager and SharePoint. I'm still on the SharePoint machine. If I load up the management console here and add to this the certificate snap-in, and then I'm going to select the computer account. And it's no point selecting my account, my administrator account. We need to be working with the computer account here, and obviously it's the local computer. Here we can view the certificate store and also work with it as well. You can see we have SharePoint element here. In here we have certificates. This is our effectively local farm. We also have trusted root certificates where you'll see what you would expect, including the certificate authority that's in our environment. Indeed, for most of the things that we need to do with respect to IIS, we can actually use this tool. So we do have a graphical user interface approach for managing it. PowerShell certainly, once you get to grips with the provider syntax, is clearly better for productivity and automation. Okay, so that was just to demonstrate certificate exchange in the simplest way I can without kind of having a whole complicated scenario. Next thing we need to deal with is the basic web application SSL certificate. So I don't have a web application other than Central Admin. So I want to go ahead and create a new one. And unfortunately, we have to wait whilst it creates a web application. I always seem to get lumbered with demos where you have to wait for a service to start or something to be provisioned. And this is just really demonstrating the lack of configuration ability of SharePoint to be able to manage the metabase settings in IIS related to SSL. So I'm not going to use a host header. I am going to say use secure sockets layer. And when we come down here, you can see still says port 80, right? It's not enough to say you use secure sockets layer. Of course, we can do SSL on a non-default port, but that just doesn't make any sense, right? Because it needs to be available via the firewall that's protecting us. If we put it on port, 12990, again, just like with Workflow Manager, we've got additional configuration to do it. Traditionally, the reason for that is we don't want those conflicts. You remember the historical restriction there. So we changed that. Now it's how we want it. So the people who are really on the ball, it's not quite how we want it, but I'm going to come back to that. And I'm going to create a new app pool, which actually is already on the machine, but SharePoint just thinks it isn't there. And actually, I'm going to change that just because I don't like that bit there. Okay, so that's no big shakes there. We've all been through this hundreds of times, I'm sure, and it'd be the same if we're using the PowerShell commandlet to create the web app. Although we set the port and we selected use SSL, we still need to apply that certificate, right? There was no browse for a certificate from the local machine store and use this certificate. Also note that there was no ability for us to select the IP address that this web application should be binded to, okay? Because the SharePoint configuration mechanism is not aware of those settings. Okay? And it's been like that from day dot. So unfortunately, we need to wait for this to create the web app. So I'm going to switch to the domain controller and just demonstrate how you enable, if I can get my domain controller to wake up, demonstrate how we enable the use of SAN certificates or subject alternative name certificates with our own domain certificate authority. So this is the domain controller that's also running the certification authority. I'm going to load that up. I may have already done this. I'm pretty sure I reverted it. By default, let me switch to the web server over here and go to IIS. Nope. If we come down in here into our server certificates, over here on the right-hand side, we can create a certificate request which will then send to a third-party authority and so on. If I want to use my domain CA, I've got this here called Create Domain Certificate. This will take a few moments because it's querying the domain to find out where the CA is and then what type of templates are available to us. So I'm kind of making it more difficult for myself by trying to do the web app and this stuff on this machine. But you can see it doesn't ask us what type of certificate we want. Right? It's taken us straight into this screen here with the attributes of our certificate that we want. So if I want to give us more control there, we need to enable the SAN certificate. And basically, the screen previous, the IIS screen does not allow us to request a SAN certificate. Okay, we have to do that through the certificate snap-in. So in our certificate templates, we right-click that and choose Manage. That takes us to all the available templates in the system. These are the ones that are effectively exposed. These are the ones, all of the ones that we could choose to do. And based on our permissions, drives what we can request. So I'm going to go to the Security tab here, and you can see that, I think I've already done it, which is good. This here, fab SP1 is effectively the computer account of my SharePoint server. And you can see down the bottom there that it has enroll checked. So that's not like that by default. Now, would you do this in the real world? Probably not. You're going to use an Active Directory group of the SharePoint servers in the environment that you want to be able to request certificates. Would you do it directly from the SharePoint machine in the real world? No, probably not. You'd do it elsewhere, and then you would copy the certificates to the machines you want. So by setting that configuration, if we go back over here, and we don't use this, but we use the MMC, again, we'll load up, I had it open, so save a little bit of time. Go to the personal store, and it's not personal, that's personal to the machine, okay, to the machine account. Come over here and do request new certificate. We get this begin screen, and you can see here now, I'm sorry. We choose the AD enrollment policy. The next screen will give us the type of templates that we have permission to enroll from this server. And this should include 2 options. So now we can see we have a computer certificate, which would be just great if we just needed a single host name and so on. But now I can choose web server, and I have to click this hyperlink, which will give us this screen, which allows us to select all of the attributes and fill in the details. And we can go ahead in here, fill out everything. It's very similar to the screen we saw in IIS, but it allows us to add different names. So if we want the wildcard for the domain, in my example, it would be this. So that's now our wildcard attribute added to the subject alternative name certificate. Go through the rest of the required properties, click OK, it's going to enroll, and then that certificate is available on the machine in the same way as a regular certificate would be. If we flip back to IIS, I'm going to go through and do, for our web application that we hope has been created, thankfully, go ahead and create a site collection. We'll just call this SPC14. No, we won't do that. Don't like those guys. We'll do a team site and put our user in. It's also amusing that this field does not accept a user principal name, right? And we'll click OK. And we get this lovely status page, that tells us how long it's left to run. We'll leave that to create the site collection. I'll cancel out of here, actually. We can see the site here in our bindings. So it's HTTPS. It's set that correctly. Our port is set correctly, but we don't... I already had it there on the machine, so that kind of ruins my demo. If I hadn't have already enrolled this certificate on the machine, I wouldn't have an SSL certificate. Okay, so I'm going to remove that to get the demo back to where it needed to be. Apologies for that. Should have noticed because it's there. Hoping that finishes as well. So our binding is broken by default, right? If we try and browse this site collection, it's not going to work because there's no certificate. Also note that we have this host name. That's actually the host header that we might have chosen to enter when we created the web application. Okay? And also note this server name indication. I always get that name right. It's indication, not identification. This allows us to have multiple host names and SSL certificates on the same IP and port combination. So by leveraging SNI, I don't need to have multiple IP addresses in order to do multiple host names with SSL. Has our site collection been created? It has, so we're going to attempt to browse to it. Can't be displayed because IIS doesn't know what's going on at this point. It's refusing the request. So let's go ahead and request the certificate. It's very straightforward. You can do it in the UI, in IIS, or if there are any other points of configuration. Oops, go to the right place. Create a domain certificate. Now, for those paying attention before I deleted it, you would have noticed that I used a fully qualified name for the certificate. This is very important because, again, SharePoint is very keen on not using fully qualified names. And we need the name of the site that we browse to or make the request to match the common name on the certificate, otherwise we get that certificate warning again. Okay? So in this case, I want my URL to be fabsp1.fabricam.com. Okay? My organization is the top 10 influencers. Sorry, Victor, you didn't make it, mate. And, whatever we can put in here, put IS, Edinburgh, Midlothian. In this particular case, these don't really matter, these values, right? The first one matters, the others don't. It does matter if you're doing this as a public certificate request because there's a process that company is going to go through. It's a little bit more than just typing in the URLs in a box, right? They are going to validate that top 10 influencers is actually at this address and so on and so forth. So we click Next. Here's where we select our certificate authority. We might have more than one in our environment. In this case, I've only got the one. Select that. And then the friendly name. This is very important. Technically, doesn't matter what this is. Any of you in here good at memorizing GUIDs? Yeah, there's a couple of guys. Yeah, that's my thing. You guys are golden, right? But for the rest of us mere mortals, when we're managing certificates with PowerShell, one of the best tips I can give you is to leverage the friendly name, because otherwise you end up having to retrieve things based on the certificate thumbprint, which is like a GUID, but even worse. Okay? I tend, for things like this, for simple scenarios like this, I'm going to use the same as my common name, right? So we're working consistently across the board. It's also very handy because, guess what? That's also the name of our site collection, isn't it? So we've got that one string in our PowerShell that we can use to pipe into, the operations against the site, grabbing context and all the rest of it. So we click Finish, should have our certificate available to us in a few moments. Famous last words. Cool. So now we can go back to the SharePoint web application, go to the bindings, and basically just attach that new certificate in here. Click OK. So we're done. So if I go back now and refresh this, it's still not going to work because I didn't use the fully qualified name when I created the web application. So that's a key gotcha. You've got to remember to do that. Because, it will work, but I have to click through the warning page because the name doesn't match what I've typed in the address bar there at the top. If we are in that situation, there's this causes a lot of problems, right? Because not only is it a NetBIOS name, but it's also an individual server name, okay? We don't want it to be a server name because, excuse me, the days of single server solutions should be, long since past. We want that to be, myamazingintranet.fabricam.com or whatever. So there's our certificate warning. If we continue, then obviously it will work once the working on it has finished. Oh, hasn't even started. So, we get this question all the time. We're doing hostname site collections, with no host header on the IIS binding. We create the web application on server 1. What's this all about? How do we fix this? Well, it's very simple, assuming you can remember the right screen to go into. I'm just going to go into our alternate access mappings. I'm going to click that there. I'm going to come in here. And I'm going to do fabricam.com. And, I can change this to be whatever I want as well, right? This could be My Amazing Intranet. That's all there is to it. Fixed. So for any scenario like where you're leveraging hostname site collections and you want it to actually be, more than one server, you can obviously do that. You can't. You see, the thing is, you can't do that at the point of creation because there is no host header. Unless you enter a host header, it'll be the server that creates the web application in the public URL. Oh, that's nice. Probably because I did that halfway through. Yep. The one that's configured using Windows authentication. Preferably the default zone. Yeah, that's always the recommendation. Yeah, that's an interesting question. The question is, if I have multiple zones, which one do I use for the configuration of the search crawler? And whilst a lot more things now work regardless of the zones, there's still things that don't. So stick to using the default zone. Okay, I'm not quite sure why this has gone wrong, which is quite embarrassing because that's the last step of my demonstration. I'm sorry? Okay, so an example from the gentleman down here is that the thumbnails in PowerPivot don't work if it's not in the default zone. The default zone also has implications for apps and various other things as well, depending on the build you're in. So can anybody guess why this is not working at present? When it was working before, when I clicked through the certificate warning, right? At this point now, SharePoint's just kind of blown up and given up hope on me. Man says IIS reset. I'm up for that challenge. Which, of course, is not officially supported on Windows Server, right? Any longer. Let's kill all of these as well, just, for the sake of it. It should work. Done this hundreds of times, and it always works. Not that you believe that, of course. Yeah. Yeah, what actually may have caused this is because I was doing other things, that might have kind of messed up the creation of the site collection. But the first time I browsed to the URL when it was just FabSP1, I right-clicked the link after the creation of the site collection to browse in a new window. Okay, wait for that to warm up. Just want to show a couple of other things. We've done a single server here. If I want to get that certificate onto the other 2 web servers in my farm, I need to copy that certificate to those other machines. You can do that with the MMC snap-in. You can also do that very simply with exporting the PFX certificate and then importing it on the destination machine. So using these type of snippets, you can very easily and quickly put together a non-complicated way of provisioning out the certificates to the machines you need in the farm. Yep?
You modified the web server template to have the private key exported.
Yes. Yeah. Victor's point here is if you want to use this particular example, you need to export the private key as well as the certificate, along with the certificate, I should say, to the other machine. So if the template you use to issue the certificate has been modified for that, you can use this approach. Another thing that working on it. See, so who was the gentleman that suggested I run an IIS reset? Oh, it's Andras. That's cheating. So Andras is officially the SSL master because I didn't do anything wrong. I just needed to because I upped that internal URL, okay, things got a little bit confused. If I'd have just gone and done something else, gone back to the slides or whatever, and come back in a few minutes, it would have got itself together because the web application provisioning job needs to run for that change to fully take effect. It's even more true the more web servers I have in the environment as well. Of course, I would have liked to have, in the real world, I'm going to do the configuration perhaps with PowerShell anyway, but that's how you get around it. And of course, we can click this to stop it spinning, which is fantastic. Okay. One last thing, because it was requested. We get a question quite often. How do we deal with CRL checking in environments where we don't have internet access on the server farm? So again, it's quite common. A legacy sort of policy is to not allow internet access on the SharePoint machines inside sort of some protected network. Now, if we're serious about cloud technology, even if we're hosting everything on premises, we need to kind of get away from that kind of model because we kind of need the internet to be doing those things, right? But nevertheless, there's still valid scenarios where internet access isn't allowed. So we've basically got 2 options. The first one is to disable CRL checking. No, bad idea, right? That's the sort of thing you do on a development environment. That IOS vulnerability is very tightly related to the ability to do certificate revocation list checking. What we can do is prevent the other workaround, the recommended workaround, at least for SharePoint for now, for the time being, is to export the root SharePoint certificate using lines 35 and 36, and then import it into the trusted root authorities in the same way using the MMC snap-in. So let me do this here. That's exporting it out to a file, SharePoint root authority.sir, on the C drive. And let's now imagine I've gone to another machine. Well, I need to do it here as well, but I need to do it on the other machines in the farm. I'm going to add it this time into the trusted root certification authorities element, all tasks, import, browse to that file. There we go. Click next. And that will prevent the CRL checking from going out to the internet. It's not a perfect solution, of course, but it's better than just not doing it at all. Just finally, Yay. Awesome. So that's a quick review of some of the types of things that we need to get familiar with. Basic configuration of SSL for web applications. Also touched on the SAN certificates and so forth. So in the last few minutes, just wrap up with some recommendations in this realm. First, well, for Office 365, we already saw the SharePoint one across the board. This is really talking to the identity federation scenario, right? If we're going with Office 365, we really want to get the richest experience. We're making a long-term commitment to identity collaboration, federation with Microsoft Online. So the best way to achieve this is to acquire either a public SSL certificate from, VeriSign, Fuate, etc., or use a domain one, but preferably a public certificate because we're going over the internet here. We've got to deal with our clients. If we want to leverage sharing with other organizations, etc., that domain CA thing isn't going to help us. There's a minimum of 2 certificates required. One SAN certificate, which is going to include all the URLs for things like Exchange Discovery and so on, and then one and our SharePoint web applications. And then one wildcard to support the SP apps. Make sure you've got if you are using a domain CA, a working, documented renewal process. If you're using a vendor, you're going to a public authority, you need to make sure that, it's not just one individual on the email for the renewal, okay? You've got to be aware of those kind of things. Self-signed certificates, yes, you can make it work, but it's really just, that's for a lab environment. 365 is on the public internet, which is also now called the cloud. Therefore, we should be using public certificates. For apps, we may need to use SNI, as I mentioned, but really the tasks when we get to configuring hybrid scenarios is all around the configuration of the web apps, which we've already seen. Okay, so for on-premises, there's different styles or different flavors of on-premises, right? Internet-facing should be fairly self-evident. We need this to be a public certificate authority because our audience is the entire internet, and our client devices should trust the root CA, otherwise they're going to see the warning page. For intranet-facing, domain certificate authority, effectively what I have on the demo machine, is the best approach. None of the things that I did were difficult. It's just finding the information. There's easy ways to automate it. The flip side to that is we then are in the business of managing that CA, right? We need to make sure that it's highly available. We've got disaster recovery in place, et cetera, et cetera. We're protecting that investment. We also obviously need a few more servers there. So it's not a trivial deal. Fundamental thing is if we move to this, not only are we dealing with our risk mitigation, but we're also preparing ourselves to move closer to the new world of cloud and hybrid. Development environments, if I'm doing development environments for myself or for customer teams, I'm still going to kind of try and get them to use a domain CA, right? Because the more experience you have with it, the better, right? Just because somebody's a developer doesn't mean they don't need to understand certificates, because they're going to have to be configuring all this S2S gubbins on their development workstations. The more hands-on they have with this, the better. In the same way, you could apply it to talking about the web config file or something like that, or the IIS metabase. But, if you can't go down that road, or it's a very small dev team, or they're getting started with SharePoint and IIS, etc., then self-signed is okay. But obviously, understand the fact that you're going to need to do that kind of little extra validation step to move to the more real-world scenario. Just because you have a domain CA doesn't necessarily mean that you're giving your developers administrator control of the domain CA. Just want to point that out. And then finally, to kind of go back to this point, feedback. We need feedback in terms of scenarios or blocking situations that you hit. The best will in the world, never going to be able to test all of the scenarios. The investment is going to concentrate on the ones that have the most value initially. So for things where the wild card is a problem, even though we may be cognizant of the fact that there's nothing technically can be done about that, the feedback that is provided that underlines just how important that is, drives investment in terms of product changes, but also in guidance and evangelism efforts as well. So if you're hitting key blockers, feed that back. We really need to get to a point with things like SSL where we're covering all the cases and explicitly calling out the ones that are just not possible, rather than covering the most common. It's interesting to me that with the workflow manager and in many other places, in the SharePoint farm, we can configure the SharePoint farm to allow OAuth over HTTP. We have to have that setting, otherwise there's no way we get developers on board on this platform. Okay? It's got to be that way. No arguments. We've also got to deal with the work and energy that needs to go into getting the prerequisite stuff in place as respect to the wildcard certificate for the app IDs. And also, things I didn't mention is, just configuring the app hosting infrastructure with the DNS and, should it be a subdomain, should it be the same domain, all those kind of moving parts. SSL is one of those moving parts, and it's the combination of them all together that make it work. User profile is included in there as well. So, don't be shy. I know you're probably not shy anyway, but just to keep it coming, because the more we get this feedback, the more we can push that into guidance and future direction. So to wrap up, SSL is the cloud protocol. We should be using it even on premises. Right? We need to be getting ready, moving closer to it, even if we know that we're not going to go there for 5 years. Right? The configuration is easy, but it's not as easy as it should be, right? We need improvements in the products, and it's not just SharePoint, right? It's the other pieces of the puzzle, like Workflow Manager, etc., the PowerShell. And the experience with the configuration from an IT or infrastructure SharePoint practitioner's perspective is hugely valuable, both in terms of being able to perform the configuration, go into places and validate what's wrong with a configuration that isn't working, but also explain the requirements to customers, because they're the people who end up having to buy the certificates, is incredibly valuable. And also remember the boring bit at the start that you're all thinking, I wish he'd get on with the SSL certificate stuff, right? That underlines everything we're doing here. We need to always, not from a sort of product change perspective, but more from a requirements perspective, challenge outdated models to information security when we're moving into cloud and hybrid scenarios. So with that, I know, I've got 1 minute left. Pretty good. Thanks very much for staying all the way to the end, even though there's many smarter people downstairs in the Ask the Experts. I would suggest, given the time and the ATE, if there are questions, well, we don't have that many people. I'm happy to take questions at the mic, or we can do it at the Ask the Experts. It's entirely up to you. But if you do have a question, please use the microphone so that's recorded. Thanks for staying with it all day. I know it's a long day. Thank you.
I've got one question.
Sure.
Going back to the Kerberos discussion you mentioned earlier for apps, is there any performance drawback from using, what is basically falling back to NTLM? Because if I look at TechNet, they say Kerberos is supported, but it says if you use NTLM fallback, which I'm kind of inferring means Kerberos might work if you configure SPNs, but most people aren't going to do that.
Correct, yeah. I mean, you can configure Kerberos for app IDs, but you require an SPN for every single app ID. So every time you install the app, it doesn't work. Remember, you cannot configure Kerberos only in a supported fashion with SharePoint, right? We can't use the SSPI provider for that. So we're always going to be a situation where it may fall back. But if we wanted to, we could configure Kerberos, and we'd have to go into the SPN for each app, create it, restart the identity of the web application, and re-request it. So it's not feasible that would happen, but technically it could take place. But yeah, there's still going to be fallback for the SPNs you don't have and for the clients that can't do anti-LM. And is there a performance impact there? Yes. I mean, there is a performance difference between the two authentication protocols, authentication mechanisms. Whether it's enough of a difference for it to have negative impact is debatable now, especially with adequately spec'd web servers and so on and so forth. If you have a kind of traditional deployment where you've made a conscious decision to go with Kerberos primarily for performance reasons, then you're out of luck with apps, and that's a gap. Yeah.
So there isn't enough of a justification to have kind of a, like a router web application configured for NTLM, for example, because that's one other sort of, that's the only other thing you could do, I guess.
I mean, you could also look at delegating, constrained delegation using a proxy device as well. But again, we're now talking, think about that slide with the complexity trade-off, right? Do we really need Kerberos? If it's not a policy requirement for Kerberos, can we do other things to get the same performance boost that we might get with Kerberos? It's very difficult to give sort of general guidance here and say, well, you should start with this, because every environment's different. Good reason why organizations use Kerberos for performance reasons is multi-forest, multi-domain scenarios, especially ones that are over wide area networks. And in those type of scenarios, I mean, if that's more important and is in play because it was done for SharePoint 2010 and et cetera, that makes it very difficult to, introduce apps into that environment, and you'd be better looking at hosting apps elsewhere, and having a separation between core SharePoint functionality and customizations. Now, I know that's not what any customer wants to hear, but that's the reality of where we are in the space technically. And of course, the long term, it's not that Kerberos is dead, because obviously certain functional things require it. But longer term, people are going to be using trusted provider identity, and then, of course, these considerations move away. But to get to that point, the idea of multi-forest and distributed domains and so on has been, reduced. So everything's a balancing act there, and the answer is it depends.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in this case, the customer has Kerberos for BI purposes, and considering the single web app recommendation, it sounds from what you're saying like that model would probably work, even if apps are still within that same web application. I mean, I can't.
Yeah, you can make it work, but you've got to question whether the single web application recommendation is not taking into account these type of functional and strategic requirements, right? It's the trouble with any cookie cutter approach. They have a great deal of validity. And, I don't know enough about this specific deployment, but I would be much more inclined to go towards, a farm using the new model for the new stuff, and a farm using, the traditional methods for the BI stuff, right? There's no reason to have them hosted together.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Well, there might be, but you haven't said. Yeah, it hasn't come up in this conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
No problem.